Welcome to KURO-OBI WORLD podcast. Today's topic is what Chinese Kung Fu master Miyahira Sensei thinks about self-defense.
I was hoping he'd teach us some cool moves like in an action movie, but...
All right, let's get started.
So, welcome back to today's Deep Dive, The Learner. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating first-hand article written by Miyahira Tamotsu.
Yeah, he's a highly respected Chinese martial artist based over in Okinawa, Japan.
Exactly. And the mission for this deep dive is basically to completely shatter our culturally ingrained Hollywood-inspired illusions about self-defense.
Oh, for sure. Because we have this master martial artist, a guy who has literally dedicated his entire life to mastering physical combat techniques.
Right.
And he's essentially telling us that in a life-or-death scenario, his very own physical techniques are, well, they're completely secondary.
Which is wild to hear from an expert like him. He argues that your biggest enemy in a crisis isn't, the person breaking down your door. Your biggest enemy is actually your own brain.
Yeah, and Miyahira illustrates this paradox with this really revealing story about a self-defense seminar. He was asked to teach it specifically for women, and the participants arrived with a very specific set of expectations.
Right, they wanted the action movie stuff.
Exactly. They wanted to learn the actual mechanics of physical retaliation. They were looking for instructions on, like, how to reverse a chest grab, or how to break a grip.
Or how to execute a takedown.
Yeah. They wanted a tangible, step-by-step list of physical actions to neutralize a threat.
But instead of walking them through this cool choreography of counterattacks, Miyahira stood in front of the room and emphasized the importance of just screaming and running away.
Which did not go over well.
No, the crowd was visibly disappointed. They felt shortchanged, expecting a master class in hand-to-hand combat and getting what sounded like elementary school advice.
Right, and to explain that massive disconnect between what the students wanted and what he knew they actually needed, Miyahira uses this great analogy of a school fire drill.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, think about when children line up for a fire drill. They're often, laughing and talking with their friends. They walk through the hallways in a completely relaxed state.
Because their brains cannot genuinely simulate the sheer consuming horror of a real building fire.
Exactly. They are performing the physical motions of an escape, but without any of the actual psychological weight of survival.
But I do have to push back on Miyahira's stance here, just a little bit, or at least, look at the contradiction in his own career.
Oh, absolutely, because it seems contradictory on the surface.
Yeah, Miyahira is famous for demonstrating chinna.
Those are the incredibly intricate Chinese joint locks, right?
Right. And he routinely executes these precise pressure point strikes on highly viewed KURO-OBI WORLD videos. So he possesses the exact specialized knowledge those women were asking for.
Right. He literally has the skills they want.
So refusing to teach those cool physical techniques to people who specifically sought him out, it almost seems a bit dismissive of their agency, doesn't it?
Well, it looks contradictory until you examine the underlying biology of human fear, which is really the foundation of Miyahira's entire philosophy.
Okay, lay that out for us.
So he refuses to teach a 5-step pressure point sequence in a basic self-defense context because he understands the actual mechanics of the freeze response.
Right, the biological freeze.
Yeah. When an individual is suddenly confronted with a lethal threat, say an armed home invader, the brain doesn't just get scared. It undergoes a catastrophic system failure.
Wow, catastrophic.
Basically, the amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, completely hijacks the nervous system. It floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol at a rate that the conscious mind just cannot process.
So the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for logical thinking or, sequence planning and retrieving memorized instructions, that essentially just goes dark.
It shuts down entirely. And it does that to route all available energy to basic survival mechanisms.
Right.
But the physical consequences of this massive adrenaline dump are just as severe. Heart rates instantly spike above 150 beats per minute.
And at that threshold, humans literally lose their fine motor skills.
Exactly. The blood rushes away from the extremities to protect the vital organs, so your hands become numb, they become clumsy.
Which means the precise finger placement required to execute a complex Chinese joint lock.
Or a pressure point strike.
Right. It's physically impossible when you can't even feel your own fingertips or control the shaking in your hands.
Yeah, think of it like trying to run high-end software on a computer with a totally fried motherboard. The code for the joint locks is perfectly written, but the nervous system simply cannot run the program.
The techniques just stay locked inside a paralyzed body.
And in a lot of cases, the vocal cords constrict so violently that the victim can't even produce a scream. The freeze response is the brain's default setting when it can't instantly calculate a winning fight or flight scenario.
But so Miyahira's real priority is keeping people alive.
Yes, providing a false sense of security by teaching complex moves to a brain that will inevitably short-circuit. It's not just unhelpful, it's actually dangerously misleading.
So if we accept this terrifying biological reality that our prefrontal cortex will abandon us and our fine motor skills will evaporate,
Which they will.
right, then we have to adopt a completely different survival strategy. And Miyahira distills this down to a really fascinating golden rule. Basically, do not trust yourself.
Yeah, that's such a tough pill to swallow. Do not trust yourself.
You have to permanently abandon the hero fantasy. This idea that practicing martial arts twice a week means you'll just magically rise to the occasion and improvise a defense during a home invasion, it's a total cognitive distortion.
You cannot expect your future self to think critically when the actual neurological framework for critical thinking has collapsed. That is a fatal error.
So you really can't rely on improvisation.
Not at all.
And Miyahira moves from this stark biological assessment into a highly specific, very practical, tactical recommendation for a home invasion.
Right, the window strategy.
Yeah. He states that if an intruder breaks in, you need to grab a heavy object and literally smash your own window.
Which sounds completely crazy at first, right? Break your own window.
Yeah, but it makes perfect sense if you actually analyze what an intruder wants. A home invader relies on the environment being this closed, isolated container.
Exactly. They need silence to maintain control over the situation.
But the second that glass shatters, it destroys the psychological and physical barrier that's containing the crime.
It instantly introduces chaos into the intruder's controlled environment. I mean, the loud, violent noise of breaking glass immediately alerts neighbors and passersby.
It shifts the dynamic of the space from a secret hunting ground into a very public emergency.
Which is their worst nightmare. It forces an immediate time constraint on the attacker, drastically increasing their risk of apprehension. The shattered window is essentially a beacon for external intervention.
But the real brilliance of Miyahira's advice here isn't just the tactical advantage of the broken window, it's actually about the timing of the decision.
Right, going back to the freeze response.
Exactly. Because of that freeze response, you cannot wait until you hear footsteps in your hallway to evaluate your options, scan the room for a heavy object, and arrive at the logical conclusion to break the window.
Your paralyzed brain will simply not be able to connect those dots in the moment.
So survival actually requires cognitive pre-programming. You have to intentionally create a neural pathway right now during a safe, peaceful moment.
Yeah, so for you listening, this means actually sitting in your room, looking at the window, and repeatedly linking the concept of robber directly to the action of break the window.
You are building a heuristic. You're creating a cognitive shortcut that bypasses the prefrontal cortex entirely.
You're basically writing a macro for your own brain. If X, then Y.
No deliberation.
No weighing of options, no trying to access memories of complex joint locks. Just a single preloaded automatic physical response.
It's like you install the emergency software update while the system is running smoothly, because you definitely cannot write the code while the computer is crashing.
Exactly. And it is only after this baseline of survival is established, after that escape hatch is pre-programmed, and you have fully accepted the biological inevitability of the freeze response, that any physical martial arts training can even begin to be useful.
Which, honestly, introduces a massive problem for the way martial arts are currently taught and practiced today.
Oh, absolutely.
If surviving violence is entirely dependent on this intense pre-programmed mindset, the standard modern dojo environment seems woefully inadequate.
Because it's too safe.
Right. When you train in a modern gym, you're practicing with friends, with peers. There's an unspoken social contract that everyone is safe. The physical threat is essentially just a pantomime.
The danger isn't real, and the brain recognizes the safety of the environment. It categorizes the dojo practice as a form of rigorous play or a sport.
So Miyahira actually contrasts this modern environment with the era of the samurai in Edo period Japan.
Yeah, this historical comparison is fascinating. For a samurai, there was zero psychological barrier between the dojo and the street.
Practicing sword strikes indoors and then facing a lethal blade outdoors, those were seamlessly connected realities.
The violence they trained for was just a pervasive element of their daily existence.
The stakes were identical, right? The physiological state of the practitioner during training perfectly mirrored their physiological state out in the real world.
But today, that connection is completely severed. For most people, lethal violence is just an abstraction.
So if the danger isn't real, how does Miyahira suggest making the training actually effective for the real world?
Well, the neuroscientific term for this problem is context-dependent memory. Human beings recall information and skills best in the exact same psychological and physiological state in which they learned them.
Right.
So if a modern practitioner only learns a joint lock while their heart rate is resting and their mind is calm, they will not be able to retrieve that memory when their heart rate hits 160 beats per minute.
Not when their bloodstream is saturated with cortisol.
Exactly. If the brain categorizes the training as just a theoretical exercise, an actual attack will cause a catastrophic shock to the system. The thought is basically, wait, I might die. This isn't what practice felt like.
And so the practitioner will just be standing there facing a real knife, and their brain will short-circuit trying to reconcile the terrifying reality with the sterile memory of the dojo.
The shock literally overwrites the physical training.
So to fix this, Miyahira argues that modern practitioners must intensely use their imagination as a survival tool to bridge that gap.
Yes. You have to artificially induce the physiological markers of fear during safe practice.
How do you do that?
When executing a technique with a compliant partner, the practitioner has to visualize the terror of a real attack vividly enough to actually elevate their own heart rate and trigger a mild stress response.
Wow, so you got to convince your nervous system, even momentarily, that the stakes are real.
Right. This artificial simulation is the only way to unify the mind in the dojo with the mind required for actual survival.
You have to mentally overlay the horror of a real-world assault right onto the safety of the practice mat.
And without that psychological bridge, Miyahira states there is a difference like heaven and earth between someone who trains with that dark, vivid imagination and someone who merely goes through the biomechanical motions.
Because the mindset is the operating system, right?
Yeah.
The physical technique is just an application.
Exactly. If the operating system cannot handle the stress environment, none of the applications will launch.
Which brings us to Miyahira's really honest assessment of his own life's work, culminating in this profound paradox.
Yeah, it's quite a beautiful conclusion, really.
It is. After decades of mastering these techniques, understanding the paralyzing biology of fear, and cultivating the intense imagination required to bridge that gap between practice and reality, he reaches a conclusion that fundamentally separates martial arts from conventional sports.
Right, because in any sport, the ultimate objective is to apply your skills on the largest stage possible.
You train tirelessly, specifically, so you can use those skills in reality. You want to show off your skills.
But Miyahira states that the absolute ideal for the martial arts he teaches, the highest possible achievement for a practitioner, is to live your entire life and never once have to use them.
Which is just a brilliant paradox.
It's the ultimate insurance policy. You pay the premium in sweat, in rigorous psychological conditioning, and the really heavy burden of simulating terror, all with the singular hope that you will never have to file a claim.
To spend a lifetime honing a blade that you pray never leaves its sheath. It's a profound statement on the inherent value of peace, coming from a man who truly understands the chaotic reality of violence.
Absolutely. And it contextualizes all the terrifying pre-programming we discussed.
Right. You build the cognitive shortcut to break the window precisely so you can walk through the world safely, just hoping the protocol remains entirely theoretical.
Exactly.
But, it makes me think that the mechanisms Miyahira describes, the freeze response, the collapse of the prefrontal cortex, the necessity of pre-programming, these are not just limited to physical violence.
Oh, not at all. The human nervous system does not differentiate between a physical predator kicking in a door and a catastrophic social or financial threat.
The biological reaction is identical.
Totally identical.
So think about when a sudden, devastating financial shock hits, like an unexpected bankruptcy or a sudden market collapse or getting laid off without warning. The mind freezes in the exact same way.
The chest tightens, breathing becomes shallow.
And the ability to think clearly or plan sequentially just evaporates. The cognitive overload is exactly the same.
The amygdala cannot distinguish between physical death and social or financial ruin. It triggers the exact same system failure, leaving us completely paralyzed when we desperately need to make critical decisions.
Right. So the question for you listening is, What are the metaphorical windows we need to break in our everyday professional or personal lives?
That's the real takeaway here.
If we know our brains will freeze when the metaphorical intruder breaks in, shouldn't we be pre-programming those emergency circuits right now?
While we're safe,
Exactly. While we're sitting safely at our desks, we need to build a cognitive shortcut for a career collapse or a financial crisis today. What is your predefined escape hatch for a sudden layoff?
or the automatic protocol for a severe medical diagnosis.
Exactly. Because whether you're facing a physical threat in the night or the sudden collapse of a life plan, the biological rule remains the same. Do not trust your panicked self to improvise.
Build the escape route today.
So build those metaphorical windows, keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.